Imagine waking up in the heart of Manila, but instead of the Philippines, you're in the United States. Your morning starts with a pledge of allegiance, maybe still in English, maybe with a proud burst of Tagalog in between. Could Tagalog become part of official government business? Would your ballot one day list candidates from Manila alongside those from California or New York? This isn't just a thought experiment. The Philippines joining as a state would have meant a roughly 11% boost to America's population, bringing 7,000 islands and hundreds of cultures into the Union. Over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through how this alternate America might have looked. Its politics, its daily life, its economy, its global strategy, and its culture. And it all begins with the ordinary routines that mark citizenship, what it feels like to start your day beneath a 51-star flag. Daily life would showcase this collision most visibly in one place: the rituals of national identity. Under a pledge, a flag, Filipino life in a 51-state America, schools become the flashpoint. Students in Manila would stand for the American Pledge of Allegiance, some slipping in a mabuhay before the bell, while two flags, the stars and stripes and a Philippine banner, flutter over the schoolyard. It looks like unity, but to many families, it might feel like something vital being pressed under a new framework. The classroom is where cultures meet head-on. Picture lessons split between George Washington at Valley Forge and Jose Rizal penning Noli Me Tangere. Kids learning about the U.S. Constitution 1 hour and then reciting stories of the Philippine Revolution the next. Curriculum would be less about memorization and more about negotiation. Language just sharpens the tension. English at school, Tagalog at home, with kids code switching back and forth with ease. Is that bilingualism empowering? Or is it the first thread pulled from the fabric of indigenous culture? And then, the anthem. Imagine students rehearsing a version of the Star-Spangled Banner with refrains partially in Tagalog, stirring for some, awkward for others. These Americanization moves would echo Hawaii and Guam, where school systems were ground zero for cultural assimilation. The difference? The Philippines has over 7,000 islands and more than 180 ethno-linguistic groups. That sheer scale makes blending identities far more complicated. And yes, PTA meetings would get weird. Thanksgiving dinners debated alongside whether to keep Barrio Fiesta celebrations in the school calendar. At the dinner table, the conflict shifts tone, but not intensity. Parents pass down the stories of Lapu-Lapu and the revolution against Spain, wondering if their children will remember them as vividly as they remember Thomas Jefferson or Lincoln. One sharp question defines this whole struggle. Would Rizal sit in the canon next to Washington, or slowly fade into a cultural footnote? That fear would weigh heavily on families, shaping conversations at home long after the textbooks closed. Outside the kitchen and classroom, things grow political very quickly. Statehood guarantees representation, senators, representatives, a say in presidential elections. But this doesn't mean simple integration. Bringing the Philippines into the Union would increase the U.S. population by roughly 11% overnight. That's a demographic shock unlike anything in U.S. history. Congress might even break the archipelago into multiple states just to make the numbers manageable. A quick legislative fix that would still supercharge the Senate and Electoral College in a way no previous expansion ever has. And unlike Hawaii or Alaska, there's no way to sweep cultural friction under the rug here. Hawaii's statehood brought resentment from native Hawaiians, but its smaller population meant gradual assimilation was possible. The Philippines is another matter entirely. Its culture, history, and vibrant nationalism would resist invisibility. Attempts to press everyone into uniform American civic rituals could just as easily fuel sharper identity politics. Think bilingual ballots. Think local newspapers railing against federal overreach. Think outright political movements dedicated to carving out space for Filipino culture inside an American system that wasn't built for it. Still, this alternate America isn't all conflict. Cultural fusion would thrive in unexpected ways. Imagine city festivals decorated in red, white, blue, and the bold hues of Flores de Mayo. Or a classroom anthem where English and Tagalog overlap, creating something both cultures share without cancellation. These hybrids wouldn't erase heritage. They'd add new layers. Just as Filipino cuisine adapted Spanish, Chinese, and later American influences into something uniquely its own, Filipino-American culture could become more than the sum of parts. The deeper question is whether identity can stretch wide enough. Can one nation embrace Jose Rizal and George Washington, barrio fiestas and 4th of July parades without losing balance? That tension would shape public conversation constantly, everywhere from town halls to workplaces. But identity doesn't only live in pledges and politics. It shows up in smaller everyday things: the food you eat, the places where you shop, the decorations filling your local main street. And that's where the culture clash could turn surprisingly tangible. Jollibee on Main Street, everyday culture in a Transpacific nation. Imagine you're in a small-town diner in Kansas, waiting on your pancakes and coffee. You glance out the window, and across the street there's a bright red sign and a smiling bee mascot, a Jollibee. Locals are lined up for buckets of fried chicken and plates of sweet-style spaghetti with hot dogs. In this alternate America, Filipino culture isn't on the margins. It's parked right on Main Street, and there's a reason it could spread faster than other global imports. English was already widely taught and used in the Philippines during decades of American rule. That shared language would make it far easier for Filipino franchises, TV shows, and festivals to cross into the mainstream US market without as much translation barrier. Food would lead the charge. Dishes like lumpia, pancit, and lechon wouldn't stay ethnic in niche restaurants. They'd become comfort food found in grocery freezer aisles right next to burgers and tacos. Shelves could carry banana ketchup, calamansi packets, and bagoong under locally sourced labels. American chefs would play with trends: adobo sliders, sinigang ramen, deep-fried kwek-kwek on a stick beside funnel cakes at state fairs. What begins as novelty at county fairs could grow into part of everyday menus. But culture doesn't stop at food. Philippine festivals like Sinulog or Ati-Atihan could pop up in major US cities. Picture Chicago hosting barangay-style caroling in December, or Times Square lit up by Santa Cruzan processions. Some communities would welcome the color, music, and crowd energy. Others might quietly dig in, treating it as an intrusion into local traditions. That tension between celebration and resistance defines whether Filipino culture enriches America or gets watered down into a token parade. Entertainment would push next. Filipino soap operas or teleseries, packed with family drama and improbable betrayals, already have global appeal. With English fluency built in, these could stream in mainland living rooms or inspire American remakes. You flip through afternoon TV, and instead of another reality courtroom spat, you hit an English remix of a Philippine drama. Cue long stares, sweeping music, and inevitable slaps. Still, adaptation invites risk. Many Filipinos would fear their storytelling being flattened into a glossy American product, losing the flavor that made it resonate in the first place. Small-town response could be slower. It's easy to imagine coastal cities pulling off Sinulog parades or Jollibee drive-thrus. But what about rural towns? Here's the sharp personal contrast. A Filipino family in the Midwest trying to celebrate Pasko, but the nearest simbang gabi service is hours away. Their parole lights flicker alone, and only a vague nod to tropical foods exists at the local store. National visibility doesn't always translate to local inclusion. That disconnect could leave families torn between assimilation and holding on to disappearing rituals. It wouldn't be the first time America wrestled with this balancing act. Mexican Americans made tacos and Cinco de Mayo national staples, but only after weathering decades of prejudice. Japanese cultural exports like sushi and anime reshaped consumer trends, though early Japanese immigrants lived with exclusion laws. One analogy fits best here: Hawaii's statehood. Hawaiians saw visibility rise through tourism and food culture, but those gains came with pressure to commercialize or dilute their own traditions. Would Filipino identity face that same fate, embraced as flavor but stripped as foundation? And then there's economics. Filipino food chains could expand and compete in big city corridors with Starbucks-level foot traffic, not guaranteed but possible. Supermarkets would see rising demand for mangoes, coconut, tamarind, and tropical desserts like ubi ice cream. Farmers in the South might tilt toward those markets simply to keep up. Fast food menus across the US would face new competition as Filipino chains push their signature blends of sweet, savory flavors. None of this is inevitable, but it's plausible enough to wonder how much everyday life could change. Like and subscribe if you want more counterfactual deep dives. Still, all of these small shifts, food, festivals, TV shows don't stay small when added up. They build visibility. They push questions about who defines American culture and who adapts to whom. Once representation becomes mainstream, politics always follows. And in this alternate timeline, the next step isn't whether Halo Halo shows up in a drive-thru, but whether the Oval Office might one day belong to someone from Manila. So let's take the next step. With statehood, the Philippines wouldn't just nudge the numbers in Washington, it would rewrite them. This isn't a marginal addition like Alaska or Wyoming. It's a demographic wave, increasing America's population by about 11% in one move. That turns Filipino voters into one of the largest blocs in the country. A president with Filipino roots wouldn't be guaranteed, but it suddenly becomes politically plausible over time, because no candidate could afford to ignore a constituency that large. Congress would feel the shock first. The Philippines wouldn't send a handful of representatives, it would send a whole cluster, reshaping committee dynamics and caucus alliances. House maps would stretch across the Pacific, and presidential hopefuls would need to stump in Manila or Davao with the same enthusiasm they give Ohio or Florida. Suddenly you have campaign promises about Luzon's infrastructure and Mindanao's fisheries on the same national stage as Medicare and corn subsidies. It would turn every election into a transoceanic balancing act. And the Electoral College tilted overnight. Coastal strongholds would matter less compared to the Pacific's new weight. Smaller mainland states would start raising eyebrows. Why does so much of Washington's energy now flow toward an island state thousands of miles away? That frustration could feed into the same regional divides America already struggles with, only amplified. But the fights wouldn't stop at maps and electoral math. Cultural flashpoints would light up right inside Congress. Imagine a Senate panel taking up the question, should Tagalog receive federal recognition? The US doesn't even have English as its official language, and now lawmakers are suddenly debating whether bilingual documents and Philippine curricula belong in the federal budget. C-SPAN would turn into must-watch TV, with heated exchanges over whether recognizing a Pacific language undermines or strengthens American unity. Religion adds another charged layer. The Philippines brings a Catholic majority population into the fold, a force that could push questions of church and state back to the center of American politics. Senators making arguments for greater religious protections, activists rallying on both sides, court battles about public prayer. These would stop being side skirmishes and turn into front-page fights. For much of the country, it would feel like the boundaries of America keep moving under their feet. Meanwhile, the economy would lurch into new territory. On one hand, U.S. corporations would salivate at the chance to treat Metro Manila as both a manufacturing hub and a gateway into Asia without crossing trade barriers. Ford, General Electric, and fast food giants would suddenly be operating inside the Union while positioning themselves closer to Japan or China. But unlike other Asian markets, Filipino workers would be full U.S. citizens, so factories would have to follow American labor law. That means better wages and benefits, but also higher costs compared to rival production centers abroad. Some industries would flood in, others might flinch at the price tag. Globally, the ripple is sharper still. A large portion of Filipinos today work overseas to send money home. In this alternate statehood, they're already inside the United States. Migrant labor pipelines to the Middle East would dry up, shrinking remittances and leaving countries like Saudi Arabia scrambling to fill shortages. That's a labor shock, one flagged in the research as a likely international crisis. Suddenly, migrant economies dependent on millions of workers lose access to them, and the US inherits that workforce instead. And yet, America would also inherit the risks. The Philippines lies along typhoon paths, across earthquake belts, and on volcanic hot zones. Statehood would place FEMA and the federal budget under constant pressure to rebuild destroyed towns. Billions spent each year on recovery across the Pacific. Taxpayers in places like Iowa or Kentucky might ask, why should their dollars patch roads in Cebu when bridges in their own towns rot? Disaster relief would become not just humanitarian policy but political ammunition, stoking resentment that integration is too heavy a burden. Security only complicates it further. Separatist movements in the Philippine South wouldn't vanish with statehood. They'd now be fighting inside the United States. Low-level insurgencies would drain resources, provoke military deployments, and shape defense bills. Some in Washington would eventually call it a training ground for counterinsurgency tactics. Others would resent the idea that American soldiers were tied up indefinitely on home soil against armed movements committed to cultural independence. Layer all of this together and you get an America stretched politically, culturally, economically, and militarily in ways it has never been before. That's not just a new state. It's a second frontier for every domestic issue from tax fights to campaign funding. Nothing about this integration would be tidy, but everything about it would be consequential. Which leaves us with the larger question. What kind of nation emerges when unity has to carry the weight of an ocean? That's where this alternate timeline asks us to step back, not into policy charts or electoral math, but into a broader view of identity and cohesion. In this alternate timeline, the United States wouldn't just add land, it would carry the weight of a new identity. Philippine statehood means expansion colliding with cultural cohesion, daily life reshaped as much by food and language as by laws. The consequences run in three directions. Filipino traditions woven into daily American culture, an enormous new voting bloc shifting political power, and massive fiscal and defense costs as the U.S. shoulders disasters and security challenges in the Pacific. It would be transformative, full of opportunity and real friction, and much of that friction comes from geography, history, and culture, not bad faith. So here's the final question. Would you want to live in a 51-state America? Comment and subscribe if you have not done so.